Ahaha, oh, my dear viewers, today's story is a powerful one. Oh. There was a man named Samson, tall, powerful, respected, and feared. When it worked, the village part kept quiet. Nobody dared challenge him, but Faith has a strange sense of humor because before this story ends, you will be laughing at how this mighty man become the most controlled husband in the town. Sit tight. The story begins on Samson's first wedding.
Samson was a very tall man with broad shoulders, and he walked down the road with a heavy step that made people quickly move out of his way. In the large compound where he lived, which was full of many families sharing a main corridor, everyone stopped talking whenever Samson walked past their doors. He worked as a mechanic supervisor, and his voice was always loud, like thunder, booming across the compound whenever he was angry. He believed that a man must be the absolute ruler of his world, and he treated his neighbors with disrespect and pride. If a child's ball accidentally rolled to his door, Samson would seize it and pop it with a knife, warning the crying child never to cross his path again. The men in the local beer parlor feared him because he was quick to start a fight, and he usually won those fights with his heavy fists. Samson often boasted that no woman could ever look him in the eye, because he believed women were meant to be silent furniture in a man's house. He had money and a well-furnished apartment, but his heart was hard like a stone that had been baked in the sun. The neighbors whispered behind his back that pride goes before a fall, but Samson did not care about their whispers because he felt untouchable. He was looking for a wife, but he did not want a partner. He wanted a slave who would polish his ego every morning. When Samson turned 30 years old, he decided it was time to bring a woman into his house to cook his meals and wash his clothes. He traveled back to his family's village and found Mary, a young teacher who was known for her gentle spirit and extreme shyness. Mary was beautiful and soft-spoken, raised by parents who taught her that a good wife must always say yes to her husband and never complain. The wedding was a loud affair with plenty of rice and meat, and Samson looked very proud as he brought Mary back to the city to live in his apartment. At first, Mary tried her best to please him by waking up at 4 a.m. to clean the entire house before going to her teaching job. She would return early to cook fresh soup, making sure plenty of meat and fish were in the pot just the way Samson liked it. However, Samson was not a man who knew how to be satisfied, and he soon started looking for errors where there were none. One evening, he sat down to eat his egusi soup and suddenly threw the spoon across the room, shouting that the soup was too watery. Mary trembled and apologized, even though the soup was thick and delicious, but Samson only glared at her with eyes full of malice. He told her that she was useless and that he had done her a favor by marrying her, making Mary feel small and worthless. The happiness of the marriage did not last for even 2 months before the compound neighbors started hearing disturbing sounds coming from Samson's apartment. The walls of the building were thin, and late at night, the neighbors could hear Samson shouting insults that were heavy and cruel. He would scream at Mary for dusting the television room or for laughing too loud on the phone with her sister. Soon, the shouting turned into the sound of heavy slaps and the heartbreaking sound of Mary crying softly into her pillow. The women in the compound would look at each other with worry when they met at the tap to fetch water, shaking their heads in pity for the young wife. They saw the dark bruises on Mary's arms, which she tried to hide with long-sleeved shirts, even when the weather was very hot. Despite seeing the pain she was in, nobody in the compound intervened because they were afraid of Samson's anger and the police. There was also a bad unwritten rule in the community that said a man's house is his private kingdom and neighbors should not interfere in husband and wife matters. So, They just greeted Mary with sad smiles and told her to pray harder, leaving her alone in the lion's den. Mary felt completely isolated, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison of fear and pain. For 7 long years, Mary lived like a shadow in her own home, losing all the brightness and joy she once had as a young girl. She became very thin because she was too stressed to eat, and her eyes were always red from crying secretly in the bathroom. Samson did not care about her health. He only cared that his clothes were ironed and his food was ready the moment he walked through the door. One rainy night, the neighbors heard a loud commotion, followed by a sudden terrifying silence that lasted until the next morning. The next day, Samson came out screaming and crying fake tears, telling everyone that his beloved wife had died in her sleep. The doctor said her heart just stopped, but the neighbors suspected that her spirit was simply too tired to keep fighting the daily abuse. Samson organized a very big burial ceremony, wearing expensive white clothes and crying loudly for everyone to see how much he missed her. He hired a band and bought a cow, trying to show the world that he was a grieving husband who had lost his jewel. But inside the house, he was already calculating how much money he saved, now that he didn't have to pay for her hospital bills. He did not feel any guilt. Instead, he felt a sense of relief that he could now find a new wife who might be even more obedient. It had only been 6 months since Mary was buried, and Samson was already tired of cooking his own rice and washing his own shirts. He told his friends at the beer parlor that a big man like him should not be suffering in the kitchen like a bachelor. He wanted a new wife, but this time he wanted someone even younger and simpler, someone who would not give him any stress at all. He went to a different town and found a family that was struggling with money and had a daughter named Esther. Esther was small in stature and looked very innocent, always keeping her head down when elders were speaking. Her father told Samson that Esther was a very hard-working girl who did not talk much and would make a perfect housewife. Samson looked at Esther and saw a weak little bird that he could easily control and mold into whatever he wanted. He paid the bride price quickly, laughing to himself that he had found another fool to serve him. He did not know that Esther's quietness was not because she was stupid, but because she was observing everything with sharp, intelligent eyes. Esther agreed to the marriage with a humble nod, but behind her innocent face, a dangerous fire was burning. Esther moved into Samson's apartment in the city, and the neighbors watched her with pity, thinking she was just another lamb coming to the slaughter. For the first few months, Esther was the definition of perfection, doing everything exactly how Samson wanted it, without a single complaint. She kept the house sparkling clean, she cooked delicious meals, and she always greeted Samson with a kneel when he returned from work. Samson was delighted, and his pride swelled up like a balloon. He felt he was the smartest man in the world. He would boast to his friends, "You see, if you train a woman with an iron hand, she will serve you like a king." He started to relax, believing that Esther was too timid to ever challenge him, so he didn't beat her, but he still spoke to her rudely. However, Esther was using this time to study Samson like a student studies a difficult textbook for an exam. She learned his routine, she found out where he hid his money, and she listened to the gossip about what really happened to Mary. She realized that Samson was actually a coward who used noise and violence to hide his own insecurities. She was waiting patiently for the perfect day to strike, building her confidence brick by brick. Esther did not just sit at home. She secretly made friends with the neighbors, especially Mama Peace, the oldest woman in the compound. She asked questions about Mary's death and gathered information about Samson's past behavior and his deepest fears. She found out that Samson was terrified of police cases because of some illegal deals he did at his workplace. Esther also started going to the gym secretly when she went to the market, building her physical strength little by little. She knew that to defeat a bully like Samson, she needed to be strong in mind and body, and she needed a leverage that he could not ignore. She realized that Samson's power came from the fact that everyone was afraid to confront him, so she decided she would not be afraid. One evening, Samson came home drunk and kicked a plate of food over because there was not enough pepper in the stew. He raised his hand to slap Esther, expecting her to cower and beg for forgiveness like Mary used to do. Instead, Esther stood very still and looked him directly in the eyes with a cold, terrifying stare that made Samson pause in confusion. She picked up the plate calmly and walked away, leaving Samson wondering what that strange look meant. The day of reckoning arrived on a Saturday morning, 6 months after Esther had moved into the house. Samson woke up late, expecting his usual heavy breakfast of yam and egg sauce to be waiting on the dining table. He walked into the living room, scratching his stomach, but found the table completely empty and the kitchen stove cold. "Esther, where is my food?" Samson roared, his voice shaking the windows of the apartment. Esther walked out of the bedroom slowly, dressed in her best clothes, and sat down on the sofa to read a magazine. She looked up at him calmly and said, "There is no food for you today, Samson. Go and cook it yourself." Samson could not believe his ears. His face turned red with rage, and he charged toward her like an angry bull. "You are mad. You want to die today," he screamed, raising his heavy fist to crush her. But before his hand could land, Esther moved with lightning speed, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back with a technique she had practiced. She pushed him face first onto the sofa and held him there, whispering into his ear, "If you ever raise your hand against me again, I will go to the police with the evidence of how you killed Mary." Samson gasped in pain and shock, realizing that his wife was physically stronger and knew his darkest secret. Esther told him that she had witnessed statements from the neighbors and a recording of him admitting to his friends that he beat Mary. She told him that unless he wanted to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, things were going to change immediately. "From today," Esther said firmly, releasing his arm but standing over him, "you will do half of the housework." Samson was shaking with fear, his pride completely shattered in a matter of seconds. He looked at Esther and saw not a wife but a strict jailer who held the keys to his freedom. That afternoon, the neighbors were shocked to see the window curtains open and Samson standing by the sink washing a mountain of dirty plates. He looked clumsy and miserable, scrubbing the pots while Esther sat in the living room watching television with the volume turned up. It was a sight that nobody in the compound had ever imagined, and whispers spread like wildfire from room to room. Samson thought he could hide his new situation inside the apartment, but Esther had other plans to ensure he stayed humble. One morning, the water tap inside the apartment stopped flowing and they needed to fetch water from the general tap in the compound yard. Usually, this was a job for the wife or children, but Esther handed Samson 2 large yellow kegs. "Go and fetch water, Samson," she ordered, pointing to the door with a strict finger. Samson tried to protest, whispering that his friends would see him and laugh, but Esther just picked up her phone and pretended to dial the police station. Panic seized his heart, and Samson quickly grabbed the kegs and walked out into the bright morning sunlight. The compound was full of women washing clothes and children playing, and everyone stopped what they were doing to stare. There was the mighty Samson, the terror of the neighborhood, carrying water kegs like a servant boy with his head bowed in shame. Some of the women giggled and a few men shook their heads in disbelief, but Samson kept walking, feeling the heavy weight of his new reality. Mama Peace, the elderly neighbor, watched all this drama unfolding and one day called Esther to her veranda for a private talk. "My daughter," Mama Peace said, offering her a collar. "What you are doing is strange to our eyes, but I see a strength in you that is rare. How did you tame the lion?" Esther smiled sadly and explained that bullies like Samson are actually the weakest people because they only feel big when they make others feel small. She told Mama Peace that she was doing this not just for herself, but to get justice for Mary, whose spirit cried out for someone to stop Samson. "I did not use magic," Esther said. "I used his own fear against him and showed him that a woman is not a punching bag." Mama Peace nodded slowly, realizing that Esther was teaching the whole community a lesson about respect and consequence. Esther explained that she did not hate Samson, but she would never allow him to disrespect her or any other human being again. She was retraining him like a child, forcing him to learn empathy through hard labor and humility. Years passed, and the story of Samson and Esther became a legend in the town, discussed in markets and barber shops. Samson had changed completely. He was no longer the loud, aggressive man who terrorized his neighbors. He had lost some of his bulky muscle, but he had gained a quiet gentleness, and he now greeted people with respect. He and Esther ran a small business together, and while people knew Esther was the boss, they respected Samson for becoming a responsible man. He cooked, he cleaned, and he treated Esther like a queen, never daring to raise his voice above a whisper. The fear of prison had faded, but it was replaced by a genuine understanding that his life was better when there was peace instead of war. Every year, on the anniversary of Mary's death, Esther would make Samson accompany her to the cemetery to lay flowers on Mary's grave. It was a solemn reminder of the past and the price of cruelty. The story ends with the couple walking home hand in hand, a living testimony that even the hardest rock can be broken, and that true strength lies in standing up to tyranny.